Joni, thank you for being with us. It's been a wonderful treat to get to know you. I first heard you as a student of Paul Scott Wilson's, and I've had a sense that this is the first year that Paul Scott Wilson hasn't been here. And he had a lot to do with us changing our format, and he's been such a source of encouragement. And yet with each speaker, I've had more and more of a sense that he's here more than ever. And so thank you, and God bless you.
I want to offer just a big thanks to Peter and to everyone who has just extended such generosity and hospitality in this time here. This has been just a wonderfully rich couple of days, and just all of the conversations and the lectures and the workshops have just been, I think many of us will be unpacking these things in the time to come. Just a lot of richness, and I thank you for that as well. Just a note about the handout, about the outline. If this is the kind of thing that is helpful for you, bless you. If it is not, no worries. There's some more precise language that I'll be using, and I thought it might be helpful just to have it written down so that you know what I mean when I say things. So just accept it for what it is. So I'm going to start by offering a little bit of background on this topic of preaching in a disenchanted world. So in May of 2019, so just last spring, a record-setting 18 tornadoes hit the area around Dayton, Ohio, where I live with my family. And for those of you who don't know American geography, this is not Tornado Alley. This is not something that normally happens in Ohio. This was a freak occurrence. Among those was an EF4 tornado with estimated wind speeds of 170 miles an hour, which caused significant damage in the area around the seminary where I teach. In the aftermath of this, a local pastor friend posted on social media something along the lines of, "God isn't playing around, Dayton. Listen up, God is speaking." And I thought, this is where you want to go with this? So the following Sunday, this same pastor preached a fiery sermon linking the tornado and other events in the news to the end times, urging listeners to get right with God before it was too late. Positively, then, the same pastor also posted on social media in the days following the tornado about various relief and cleanup efforts, also ascribing these events to the hand of God. Just to put your minds at ease, I want to say that no human life was lost in this tornado. It was sort of renowned in the fact that all of these tornadoes hit and no one died. So we're not dealing with that level of gravity here. So my friend may be right. God could have caused these tornadoes. However, climatologists explain the tornadoes in another way. They say that tornadoes are caused by moisture, atmospheric heat, and wind shear. Further, there's been increasingly a lot of discussion around the role of human-caused climate change in extreme weather events like this. People have definitely impacted their environment. Through urbanization, increased population density, tornadoes are far more destructive when they hit an urban area than when they hit a rural area. I am a person of faith. I am a Christian seminary professor, and I believe that God is active in our world. But I confess to finding the climatologist's explanation more credible in this instance. At one time, our world was dripping with connections to transcendence. Even with competing divisions in the church and struggles with faith, flat-out unbelief was unheard of. Attributing events such as natural disasters and neighborly behavior to the hand of God was common. We need not look so far back in history to hear stories of how people prayed that God might send rain to end a drought, or how God punished people through a hurricane or a military loss. However, today, such comments are rare. This is a result of shifting cultural norms around what Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor calls conditions for belief and sources of ultimate authority. And these are hallmarks of a secular or disenchanted age. It's important to note that secularism is not something that is out there. It's not something that we can decide to shrug off like a sweater when we're too hot. It's all around us. It is us, and it has necessarily affected preaching at a deep level. Our present secular context for preaching is rich with possibility and gifts, but preaching amidst contested sources of authority can make it hard for preachers to get to God in the sermon. In many churches, powerful truth claims that lie at the heart of the historic Christian faith are debated. As our broader culture grows less and less attuned to the rhythms and narratives and beliefs that undergird the Christian faith, how can preachers build up? How can they preach words that nurture faith while also taking secular culture seriously on its own terms? As David Schnaza Jacobson puts it in his essay, in ways that affirm that the world is good enough, a disenchanted place where vocations can be lived out, where ordinariness can be affirmed, a place where Christians led by the gospel promise in word and sacrament are freed to engage in practices of public hospitality, and yes, perhaps even evangelical conversation, and life on behalf of the world again. Such hospitality cannot be a means, just as the conversation cannot be a ruse for domination. Somehow we must see that the gospel pulls us forward into deeper connection with God's good and secular creation. A desire to take the world seriously on its own terms is part of the challenge of preaching in a culture of secularism. Another side of this relational dynamic is the question of whether the church can be relevant in such a way that preaching matters for this disenchanted world. The truth is that the church is called, as it has always been called, to bear witness to Jesus Christ. Preaching participates in forming the church and nurturing faith while simultaneously serving as a public act that necessarily propels the Word of God into our world. Because our world is disenchanted, even believers may not readily see God at work. And preachers have the opportunity to help others see where God is at work in our world. Naming God's action in our sermons has powerful transformative potential, as many folks have said in the last few days. It is arguably the most important and one of the most difficult aspects of preaching. So in this lecture, I'll be talking about how to preach about God and the power of God in the still shifting and evolving late modern context of secularism, and particularly how preachers can activate our theological imaginations to speak God's grace to people who may not have a well-formed frame of reference for God's action in our world today. So philosopher Charles Taylor and Paul Scott Wilson are my main dialogue partners, and I'm also going to explicitly use my own context as a lens for exploring the dynamics of preaching in a disenchanted world, with the hope that all of these reflections will inspire connections to your own context as well. So I'm going to start by talking a bit about my context. I live in an older suburb outside of Dayton, Ohio. I am a Mennonite, as I've shared before, currently worshiping at a Presbyterian Church USA congregation, and I also teach at a United Methodist seminary with a very diverse student body. Being a Mennonite in these settings gives me a unique perspective concerning secularism and the relationship between the church and the world. Mennonite theology is known for emphasizing the primary allegiance to God and the church, and de-emphasizing or perhaps seeking to engage maybe suspiciously or lightly with broader culture. And we can see this modeled most clearly, I think, in our theological cousins, the Amish. The contexts where I live and worship lack racial and socioeconomic diversity. Like many places, the Dayton region experiences racial and socioeconomic separation and segregation. Now, Charles Taylor's work also focuses on trends that are mostly measured in a white Western context. It's one of the critiques that his work has gotten. So that works for me. Although I do want to note that my seminary is quite a lot more diverse. About 50% of our students are African American, and I have observed anecdotal differences in how students from different racial backgrounds do engage with some of these elements of secularism that I'm going to be talking about. So let's talk a little bit about the signs of secularism that I see in my suburb. So the separation of faith from the rest of life and contested sources of authority are active parts of my preaching context. They're also part of Taylor's definition for a secular age, which I will offer in a minute. In my neighborhood, I'm sure as in many of yours, practitioners of different faiths and no faith live and work alongside one another peacefully. Nevertheless, naming deeply held convictions often feels risky, and faith leaders in our community engage with their own congregation almost entirely in isolation from each other and from our non-religious neighbors. While a bit of a Christian gloss, I would call it the dregs of Christendom, still cling to the surface of our suburb, increasingly I do have neighbors and friends who find meaning in life completely apart from any religion. Other suburban areas have infamously illustrated the challenges of contested sources of authority inside the church. Many of you here will be familiar with this situation. So near here in suburban Toronto, pastor of West Hill United Church, Greta Vosper, has been a controversial figure in the United Church of Canada. A self-avowed atheist, she nearly had her credentials revoked. However, in late 2018, the United Church reached a confidential agreement with Foster that allowed her to retain her credentials and continue to lead her congregation. The moderator of the United Church of Canada voiced a sense of ambivalence around sources of authority that serves as one of the hallmarks of secularism. In a statement to the broader church, he wrote, "In a letter to the church in 2016, my predecessor, the very Reverend Jordan Cantwell, reminded us that at the heart of the concerns being raised is a tension between two core values, both of which are central to our identity as the United Church. The first is our faith in God. The second is our commitment to being an open and inclusive church. The dance between these core values, how they interact with and inform each other, is one that we continue to explore as followers of Jesus and children of the Creator." So the situation expressed and experienced by Vosper and West Hill United is unusual in its extremeness, but the struggle around authority and belief is very common. In a recent conversation with a pastor in my neighborhood, she shared that she no longer uses the Apostles' Creed in worship because in her decades of ministry, numerous people have told her that they don't like to be forced to say things in worship that they don't believe, and she wants to respect their positions. So the Creed no longer has practical authority around belief in her congregation. Not saying the Creed, because one can't affirm all of it, may be a symptom of a bigger challenge in talking about how or even if God is active in our disenchanted world at all. Charles Taylor describes secularism in three broad ways. The first is a classical understanding of the difference between temporal or earthly activities after the fall, which are classified as secular, and that which is sacred. James K.A. Smith, which I've got him listed on the bibliography at the back, and he is a wonderful guide if you are interested in Taylor, but you don't want to tackle the almost 900 pages that is his book. He puts this in a simpler way using some medieval terms, that while the priest follows a sacred vocation, the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker are all engaged in secular pursuits. So that's the first definition of secular. He also notes that for Augustine, secular has to do with an understanding of time, kind of an expanded understanding of time, as the time between the fall and the fulfillment of God's realm among us. So like this entire time, which encompasses the entire Bible and us today, would be like secular time, according to Augustine. Another aspect of secularism concerns the relationship between religion and public spaces and the wane of Christendom. Taylor notes that references to God or any ultimate reality beyond the here and now are largely absent from public spaces in the North Atlantic world. We go to work or school, we vote, we walk our dog, we attend concerts and movies, knit sweaters, play a game of pickup basketball, and invest for retirement, all without necessarily referring to God or any religious beliefs. This is quite different from earlier eras when the church and Christian teaching would have dominated almost every aspect of life. While some may decry this marginal voice for religious beliefs in daily life, secularism in these various spheres of life still allows believers to have an active faith, and it allows people of different religions and those who ascribe to no religion at all to live together in peace. This is really important and really good. So this is one of the gifts of secularism. Although Taylor does note that some may mourn a time when there was more integration of faith and public life. For example, Christian prayer in public schools. This is something that some people are nostalgic for. This tidy separation of arenas where we talk about our faith and expect to encounter God, so church, and the spaces and places where we may bracket out our beliefs, like the rest of our lives, creates a challenge for preachers. Creating this kind of strict separation can hinder meaningful application between the scripture and traditions of the church and the everyday secular beliefs and lives of listeners. Or in Paul Wilson's theological grammar, the connection between the Bible and our world becomes challenging because of this situation. So Taylor's third understanding of secularism has even more profound implications for preaching. He defines secularism as having contested sources of ultimate authority. The logic goes that at one time belief in God was uncontested, but now Christian beliefs are considered to be one option among others, and frequently not the easiest ones to embrace. Taylor describes a perspective likely held by many of us, most clergy, and I would say many members of our congregations as well. He writes, "I may find it inconceivable that I would abandon my faith, but there are others, including possibly and likely some very close to me, whose way of living I cannot, in all honesty, just dismiss as depraved or blind or unworthy, who have no faith, at least not in God or the transcendent." The rise of the possibility of exclusive humanism, coupled with a turn away from transcendence, has led to our ability today to construct meaning and significance without any reference to the divine or transcendence. For pastors, this saturating sense of the secular is an implicit and often unexamined but inescapable part of our preaching context. To reiterate, it's not so much how secularism has affected what we believe, but it has affected the conditions for our belief. So it's affected the container in which we live and exist, the air in which we breathe. It's permeated us at a level beyond self-awareness. So in addition to the privatization of faith and contested means of authority, according to Charles Taylor, our secular age is also marked by 5 distinct attributes that are different from the pre-modern world. And these attributes affect preaching from the way we explore Scripture to the theological shape of the sermon and the stories we use. The first is that meaning is made internally. The second, that belief is mostly individual. The third is a loss of tension between the call of the realm of God and regular life in a mundane world. The fourth is that we live our lives chronologically with little sense of connection to higher time or kairos time. And finally, that the transcendent cosmos has been distilled into an independent universe without mystery, where processes are viewed as natural rather than supernatural. So in comparison with pre-moderns, Taylor is clear about the world that is now lost to us, one in which spiritual forces impinged on porous agents, in which the social was grounded in the sacred and the secular time in higher time, A society, moreover, in which the play of structure and anti-structure was held together in equilibrium, and all of this human drama unfolded within a mysterious and supernatural cosmos. So this is Taylor on what has been lost. However, preaching in a secular age is not only about loss. One of the exciting aspects of preaching today is that the relationship between faith and the rest of our lives has become more complex and multifaceted. And I think that this opens a door for imaginative and powerful preaching that can renew faith and deepen the witness of the church in varied places in our world. As John Rotman has mentioned, God is still actively getting to us. Increasingly, some see the separation of our private faith and more public lives as an aspect of modernity that is evaporating. Some use the term post-secular to refer to the expression of religious convictions in public or secular discourse and settings. So these scholars would see the integration of faith in a disenchanted world as an important means of generating the values that are needed for decision-making. British professor and researcher Elaine Graham clarifies that this is not necessarily a revival, as church membership in mainline churches in the West does continue to decline, but a new latitude toward religion opens up the possibility of preaching actually playing a formative role in public discourse. So this is like the growing edge of this conversation, is a new latitude, a new openness to perhaps having religious discourse in the public square. So I think this is where we really need to hone our imaginative and creative homiletical instincts to speak about the miraculous, the divine, God, and the hand of God in our world. However, it is not only a secular world that preachers contend with. Our churches, the sermons we preach, the devotional material we read, the way that believers talk about faith, all are situated in and saturated by secularism. And this is not a bad thing. Again, it's not a bad thing, it just simply is. And it can be helpful to call our attention to it as a means of sharpening our preaching and shaping our sermons to be as effective as they can be in nurturing faith and witnessing to God's intentions for our world. So as a deeply contextual event, preaching necessarily must adapt as people adapt. Reading sermons from earlier eras can highlight how much has changed. People listen differently. Preachers communicate differently. Aspects of secularism have made it challenging to get to God in the sermon. What I regularly witness in my neighborhood is a sense of meaning that is now mediated through autonomous and insulated internal reasoning. And this is what Taylor refers to as having a buffered self. It's a focus on an immanent frame. It's a focus on what we have here and now as being different from a transcendent frame, particularly in the application sections of preaching. And then in addition to those two things, so the buffered self, the immanent frame, there's also an increased emphasis on human agency in the sermon, which I think does at times threaten to dilute the gospel. And I'm going to focus on each of those three areas with a priority on equipping preachers to get to God. That is, to help preachers speak about God in ways that deepen and nurture Christian faith and inspire hope, hopefully, for disenchanted listeners. So the first challenge for preachers is listeners as buffered selves, and we're going to dig into this a little more deeply. Pre-modern people lived in a world where certain objects could commonly be charged with possibility, and the human self was considered more porous and less autonomous. So, for example, a religious relic could cure illness. A person could be overtaken or troubled by demons, or positively entered by the Holy Spirit and actively moved by the presence of God. We encounter this today when we read scripture passages that describe a person being possessed. Today, people consider themselves more insulated internally and more autonomous, and generally when we preach, we are addressing a natural world that we can explain, rather than a supernatural world where external forces affect us. In an enchanted world, construction of meaning involves these external forces. But Today, we make meaning as we take the situations and experiences of our lives from the world into our minds. And then Taylor refers to that as the buffered self. So we have experiences in our lives, we take them into ourselves, and here's where the meaning is made. Like inside myself, I make the meaning. Whereas in earlier eras, the meaning was made externally. There were external forces that were engaging with me. This also connects with individualism as well, because at one time the communal decision-making and reasoning was also more common. So when this autonomous, non-porous selfhood is coupled with a loss of transcendence, we can see how disenchantment affects the way that we interpret biblical texts for preaching and the arena of focus for the good news. For example, many of my preaching students explore the account of the healing of the Gerasene demoniac from the perspective of a man suffering with mental illness rather than demon possession. This angle on the text may be less troubling for some modern listeners. If we don't struggle with mental illness, then this man's suffering does not apply to us. We can remain a little bit disengaged from part of the trouble here. Preachers wanting to reach disenchanted listeners may reframe the trouble in this text, in part, as the community's response to this man. So then his restoration and their fear in the presence of Jesus, who has disrupted their social order. So then getting to God in the sermon may involve naming Jesus' healing action and the subsequent disruption as good news, especially for the man who is now in his right mind. Of course, the sermon could also get to God with a focus on Jesus' healing and compassion for the suffering man. The many in our congregations whose lives are touched by mental illness will resonate with this good news. While this text explicitly talks about an outside force affecting the man in the form of demon possession, and Jesus casting out the legion who have caused this man's suffering, it is common today for preachers to read this text through our cultural lenses of immanence and a buffered self. That is, to focus on Jesus' compassion and to call us to show compassion today. Unfortunately, our buffered senses of personhood may also inadvertently limit some avenues for healing that require vulnerability and openness in the presence of deep need. Mental illness, I think, provides an apt example. Mental illness is extremely common. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, 1 in 5 adults lives with mental illness, and 1 in 25 lives with serious mental illness. 1 in 6 children, aged 6 to 17, will experience a challenge with their mental health this year. One can assume that many in my suburban context are quietly living with mental illness. Mental illness has affected my own family. My sister was diagnosed with severe bipolar disorder as a young adolescent, and I do have her permission to share this story with you. It took many years and experimenting with a wide range of medication and treatment for her to find a place of equilibrium in her life. In a recent conversation, my mom, and I also got her permission to share this, was recounting an incident from early in my sister's illness. So this is when she was a young teenager. My sister was agitated and unable to sleep because she felt certain that demons would harm her or others in our family if she slept. After trying to reason with her, my mom knelt beside her bed and prayed aloud that Jesus would come and hold off the demons and protect my sister and our family. My sister relaxed, her breathing calmed, and she fell asleep. So my mom wondered then and now if there could also be something spiritual at work as well as mental illness. Even doctors admit that there is much that we do not understand about how the brain works. So I want to make sure I'm being super clear here. My sister is on medication, there is medical care happening, but the situation, the prayer helped in that moment. It helped her sleep. Perhaps there is space to acknowledge the permeability that can open our lives to the healing presence of God. So perhaps a sense of a more porous self when it comes to the healing power of God. Sermons can normalize our need before God and our inability to understand everything. There is nothing wrong with acknowledging mystery in preaching. In addition to the pre-modern world being infused with the presence of God, relationships also had a sacred component that encouraged more communal decision-making and ritual. In a world where evil forces were also at work, there was an important sense of comfort in the fact that the church was all in this together. So that is also something that may be missing, and I think, again, mental illness is kind of an apt example. So often there's a lot of stigma around mental illness. People do not share that burden with others. So it's another growing area, I think, for our churches. Safe spaces where we can be vulnerable are in short supply. Helping our churches to be places of safety encourages vulnerability that may foster God's healing for a range of experiences of brokenness. Preaching that healing is possible may open up listeners to this possibility, and allowing listeners to share their testimony as part of an event of proclamation cracks open our imaginations to see where God might be working and creating a sense of community rather than isolation and facing pain and brokenness in our lives and world. Preaching in a disenchanted world means giving attention to the thought processes of listeners. Secular listeners come to church but are in relationship with those who hold a range of beliefs. They are used to navigating diversity by keeping their belief private. Secular listeners are buffered selves. They are largely closed off from the influence of spiritual forces, whether they be divine or demonic in nature. So the imagination may serve as an avenue to help buffered listeners get to God. The new homiletic was forged as part of dynamic engagement with preaching in a postmodern and secular context, and it involved a turn toward the needs of listeners in preaching, including involving the imaginations of listeners as active agents in the preaching moment. Many of the shifts that have happened in approaches to preaching since the 1950s have been concerned with engaging the listener, casting preaching as an event where the text is immediately relevant to the present, allows listeners to experience the gospel for themselves rather than to rely mainly on evidence presented by the preacher. Story was emphasized as a crucial tool for preaching, as the movement of the whole sermon, as well as a means for inviting listeners to participate in making meaning for themselves. People make sense of their lives and experience through story. I've often watched my own children engage in narrative play, where they're clearly processing something that happened in their day through their narrative play. Sharing a personal story in a sermon can create a sense of relational connection or perceived intimacy. Social media platforms engage this need for processing and for communicating to allow us to make sense of images and experiences from our lives. David Buttrick's Moves and Structures approach to preaching displays an especially strong sense of this concern around how thoughts may unfold episodically in a listener's mind, and trying to intentionally design a sermon to work with the ways that people think. So trying to work with people instead of just telling people what they need to think. However, many other approaches to preaching also illustrate this sensitivity, including, as we've mentioned many times in these days, Paul Wilson's 4-page theological grammar, which moves from the expression of need or trouble to grace and gospel. So this also works with that narrative sense of how we make sense of our lives and world. Because our disenchanted age is also an age with contested sources of authority, the preacher's voice joins many others in vying to engage with listeners. Fred Craddock's classic preaching book, as one without authority, encouraged preachers to take listeners on an inductive journey that allows them to participate in imaginatively making meaning from the unfolding narrative. Preachers today are faced with navigating this fine balance. Speaking to listeners who desperately long for good news and some instruction amidst competing voices involves creating sermons that open up a space where Christ can meet them in their need. Narrative is a potent tool for experiential encounter, but the good news also needs to be spoken plainly. I think speaking God's promises as direct address can help facilitate this kind of encounter. The Christian Century has a feature where it invites readers to write and to submit short essays inspired by one-word prompts. I recently read entries around the word promise. While biblical concepts of promise may bring to mind covenant with God or God's abiding eschatological promises, most of these essays involved the experience of people keeping or making promises in relationship. Some mentioned God's hand in keeping promises, but most involved very imminent understandings of promises being broken, actually, largely in our lives, of this concept that I think has a lot of theological freight that was pretty well ignored by the essay writers. For example, several wrote eloquently about plants bearing fruit, that this was part of the promise of the seed, which is a relatable metaphor, but one that lacks reference to transcendence. This lack of reference to transcendence caught me off guard, mainly in that the Christian Century is a periodical that is oriented toward believers who might be expected to have some sense of connection to a transcendent God. Taylor describes our disenchanted world as existing primarily in the immanent frame, with some people who are open to the transcendent and others being closed off to it while being haunted by transcendence. I love this idea, especially right now or just a few days before Halloween. Look at how haunted by transcendence our world is. For those who are open to transcendence, we understand that which is good as only understandable in relationship to that which is higher than or beyond us. This is deeply, deeply ingrained in Christianity, but there are examples from other settings too. For example, recognizing reliance on a higher power in order to achieve sobriety in AA, or seeing the history of the United States, I don't agree with this, through a lens that names God's hand in the calling of the nation state. While many Christian traditions may encounter a kind of push-pull relationship between immanence and transcendence, Taylor notes how Protestantism critiqued certain aspects of the aesthetic streams of Catholicism for denying God's material gifts. And then again, the same critique has been brought against different streams of Christianity in general by people who accuse us of having a restrictive stance against earthly or sensual pleasures, mostly associated with how we express sexuality. So the sense of critique is present in multiple levels. Within the church, we struggle to imagine transcendence in our midst. How do we place the horizon that orients life and decision-making? We see God as creator, as one who wills life on earth, but we may not regularly notice or name God's continuing action or presence in our world. Theologically, we may recognize this as problematic, but it does unfold practically, Sunday by Sunday, in many of our churches. Drained of a connection to a transcendent God, then much of our faith ends up revolving around morality and ethics. Our imaginations may not have transcendence to feed upon, but the 24-hour cable news cycle and fantastic social media feeds keep our imaginations busy and stoked by fear. We practice imagining horrific circumstances that are very rare, from a shark attack to an airplane crash. News isn't news when it's common, but I think we forget that. A recent volunteer orientation session at my daughter's school spent, catch this now, 10 minutes focused on the work that volunteers would actually be doing in the school. So 10 minutes, and over 55 minutes training for the rare event of an active shooter. The officer had imagined multiple horrific scenarios, and we were asked to imagine what we would do in those circumstances. The officer apologized several times and lamented, "This is the world we live in." Even with increased incidents in the United States, a school shooting is still rare. It is way more likely that my daughter will be injured on the school playground. Being prepared is important, but I think our imaginations have been co-opted. At a continuing education event at my seminary, a group of pastors generally agreed, so there was general consensus in the group, that it was easier to preach about traumatic events than miraculous ones, because trauma and brokenness are so much more common. We have a frame of reference for them, whereas miracles exist outside our understanding of the natural order. Many Christians struggle with how to integrate these positive experiences of the miraculous. Charles Taylor poetically describes miracles as understood within modernity, I love this, as a kind of punctual hole blown in the regular order of things from the outside, that is, from the transcendent. Feels a little bit connected to what Otis Moss preached last night. This is part of how a focus on the immanent frame has affected our preaching. As awareness of transcendence has waned, the immanent frame of existence has swelled, and we now have an enhanced view of human agency in our world. What are transcendently oriented pastors serving in a cultural context and congregation with little awareness of transcendence to do? Well, preachers certainly don't deny God's existence, but in many contexts, then, our preaching tends to focus on people, biblical people and people today. In some settings, this focus on people is put together with a call to action. Because the transcendent sphere is so marginal and our focus is on life here and now, preachers tend to elevate human potential, and sermons risk becoming Pelagian pep rallies, with the Holy Trinity cheering us on from the sidelines. This quote from Teresa of Avila is a favorite among many of my students for ending their sermons, and I'm sure we may have used it in our services as well. Christ has no body now but yours. No hands, no feet on earth, but yours. Yours are the eyes through which he looks compassion on the world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands through which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands, yours are the feet, yours are the eyes, yours are his body. Christ has no body now on earth, but yours. Now, this beautiful, eloquent quote comes from another time, and I think we can recognize what Teresa of Avila is getting at here, but transported into our world with the elevated sense of the immanent and of human agency, this actually does not feel like good news always in the sermon. Rather, it seems to fit Paul Wilson's definition of trouble in the sermon as that which puts the burden on humanity to do something or be something they are unable to do on their own. Humanity's shift from a default setting and belief in God to the possibility of making meaning apart from God to what Taylor calls exclusive humanism has meant that our world has become infused with a greater sense of meaning, a shift from hope that lies in the glories of transcendence to a hope that lies mostly in a transformed world. We see this reflected in preaching that focuses on this world, that calls us to hope and to ethical choices based on greater good being done by people here and now. At the same time, there is a collapsing of what flourishing looks like. James Smith notes that the flourishing of creation is actually not the same as thy will be done. So the heart of this lecture has involved an encouragement, I hope, and an empowerment of imaginative sermons that get to God, that is, communicate the good news. Homiletically, we actually don't need to bifurcate the actions of God into a transcendence versus immanence battle. Our triune God rules heaven and earth. We can preach both. By talking about God working through people as active in this immanent frame, we open pathways to transcendence. To return to our earlier example of preaching on the Gerasene demoniac, a sermon that focuses first on Jesus' healing without needing to define whether the man suffers from possession or mental illness, leaves some creative space for healing possibilities. Application to our world could focus on Jesus' healing work today through people who seek to alleviate suffering and isolation on a number of fronts. One could envision talking about a program for visiting shut-ins or people who have sought to bridge systemic discrimination to build relational and structural healing. A preacher could tell the story of churches who stood with those who were suffering with AIDS in the 1980s. One example from Ohio would be Antioch Baptist Church in Cleveland, Ohio. They were really on the front edge of that and just did a lot of powerful work when other churches were sadly silent on that issue. Preaching that seeks to facilitate an event of encounter with Jesus and, in a sense, brings Jesus into our immanent frame. This approach is common in preaching that seeks to convict listeners so that they might respond to an invitation to accept or renew faith. Such preaching is rare in my neighborhood, but preaching can still foster intimate connection by putting words of grace and care in the mouth of Jesus. To carry on with our example of the Gerasene demoniac, preachers might say, Jesus says to you today, I see you. I see your pain. I see your isolation, your loneliness and suffering. I am stronger than any illness or pain that is holding you back. I have overcome the legion that threaten you, and my love restores you to life. Taylor describes some anthropocentric shifts that led to the possibility of exclusive humanism. The first involves a focus on discipline and holy living that was associated with renewal in Western Christianity. Christianity ordered life in medieval Christendom, but in Taylor's words, people lived their faith at different speeds. There could be quite a spread between a monk on one end and a field laborer on the other. Read through Taylor's lenses, then, the Reformation sought to level life out, collapsing the distance between the secular and the profane. Ordinary people were expected to live out their Christian vocations for the glory of God. This means living into that paradox to be in the world but not of the world. Everyone now needs to satisfy all the demands of the gospel and effectively live out their various vocations. This is the often repeated tenet of Protestantism, the priesthood of all believers. So this is the idea of all of us are called to this work. So the problem with this, then, is that as the spotlight focused on how Christians were called to live in light of the gospel, God as a primary actor kind of receded into the shadows. And believers inadvertently began to exchange something secondary, which was our actions, for the primary goal of centering everything on God. Another shift is related. So without a sense of the ultimate, the arena of focus becomes purely human, purely creaturely flourishing. And this goal then seems attainable, right? And so it becomes difficult to understand what grace is and why it is essential. Positively, the profane sphere of existence is also now viewed as an arena where one might receive God's grace. Rather than only encountering Christ in the Eucharist, Luther famously pointed out that the ascended Christ sits at the right hand of God, but God's right hand is everywhere. Thus, Christ is everywhere. This is great news for preachers because it opens up the possibility of naming God's presence and diverse action in different places in our world. Nevertheless, a light humanism is present in many congregations, a derivation of the exclusive humanism that Taylor discusses. We profess belief in God, but we may live or preach as if God is not actively engaged in our world. Preaching in this vein may fail to build up a need for God, or if a need is expressed, it will be met with a call for human action. Preaching trouble, that is, naming human sin clearly, may offer a helpful path for getting to God in a humanist context. Paul Scott Wilson makes a strong case for preaching about trouble. He writes, "Our ways are not God's ways. The status quo is insufficient. The world is fallen. Trouble is in us, and we are in trouble. In God's sight, we stand guilty, yet we easily block this out. We need to be convicted of our own sin, convinced that our ways are often death, shown that we abuse our freedom, persuaded of our broken social systems, unmasked of our pretensions to love others, and known in the depth of our no-saying to God." Edward Farley describes a dualism between individual and social understandings of sin. By and large, most evangelical and mainline Protestants in North America have a very individualistic understanding of sin. For evangelicals, the most critical elements in religion are a person's piety, morality, felt responses, and destiny, with social context helpful as they enable these. Moreover, society is largely viewed as being transformed by individual acts of piety. So sin, then, is that which tempts individuals to stray from a righteous path. Suburban mainline Protestants, like my church, are also viewed as individualistic by Farley. The approach here, then, is therapeutic. The tools and language of religion are aimed toward helping people feel better and deal with life's stresses and strains. So sin would be that which makes us feel stressed, inadequate, anxious, depressed. Farley locates social understandings of sin mainly in seminaries, mainline denominational leadership, and the Black church. A social approach views groups as vehicles for social change and transformation, and sees sin as largely present within isms that exceed any particular person's control. So climate change would be a great example of collective human sin. An individual recycling or biking rather than driving makes little difference, but sweeping laws and different regulations can bring change. Having an exclusively individualistic approach to sin is a sign of secularism. It grants individuals autonomous power. It says a poor person can pull herself out of poverty. It fails to recognize the social role of relationships and isms that can wield intense power in our world. When preaching about sin, it may be beneficial to mention social sin, but a bigger connection in my neighborhood lies with that more therapeutic sense of individual experiences of sin. The challenge for preachers is to avoid reducing the gospel to therapy. Preaching that is anchored in the cross and resurrection of Jesus Christ moves deeper than therapeutic balms and provides a deep and ultimate sense of getting to God. Preaching the cross and resurrection is not an easy path, as the Apostle Paul aptly professed in his letter to the Corinthians. We preach Christ crucified, which is a scandal to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. The cross and resurrection has the theological effect of silencing our clamoring. All purely human actions and ventures ultimately lead to the cross and death, and only God can bring resurrection from death. Preaching the cross and resurrection are part of the treasure of the church and fuel the engine of the Christian imagination as we move toward our calling as witnesses. Purely therapeutic approaches, on the other hand, dull our souls and reduce the goodness and richness of the gospel to a feeling. Christ's death and resurrection save us in the vulnerability of the present, making an ultimate claim on us. Preaching that is anchored to the cross and resurrection gets to God by exposing reality as rendered by Christ. Preachers can get to God by way of the cross and resurrection by standing in the text at hand and turning toward the cross, or by asking how the cross and resurrection might impact the interpretation and stories used in the sermon. It's usually easiest to move to the cross when moving to the sections of the sermon that focus primarily on grace and God's actions. In my preaching, this tends to happen as I transition from proclaiming grace in the biblical text to naming grace or God in our world. So I want to conclude this morning by reading a section of the poem The Time Being, a Christmas oratorio by W.H. Auden. W.H. Auden is somewhat famous for his long poem, The Age of Anxiety, which won a Pulitzer Prize in 1948. I think that the language of poetry sometimes captures the essence of a culture in a kind of snapshot that can evade other forms of language. This Christmas poem speaks evocatively of the realities of a disenchanted world that is still haunted by a desire to know God and to have God actually break into our world with a word of hope. Leaning into that desire is part of the calling of preachers who, by the power of the Spirit, participate in that inbreaking moment of encounter with the Word Sunday by Sunday. And now W.H. Auden. Well, so that is that. Now we must dismantle the tree, putting the decorations back into their cardboard boxes. Some have got broken, carrying them up to the attic. The holly and the mistletoe must be taken down and burnt, and the children got ready for school. There are enough leftovers to do, warmed up for the rest of the week. Not that we have much appetite, having drunk such a lot, stayed up so late, attempted quite unsuccessfully to love all our relatives, and in general, grossly overestimated our powers. Once again, as in previous years, we have seen the actual vision and failed to do more than entertain it as an agreeable possibility. Once again, we have sent him away. Begging, though, to remain his disobedient servant, the promising child who cannot keep his word for long. The Christmas feast is already a fading memory, and already the mind begins to be vaguely aware of an unpleasant whiff of apprehension at the thought of Lent and Good Friday, which cannot, after all, now be very far off. But for the time being, here we are, back in the moderate Aristotelian city of darning and the 815 where Euclid's geometry and Newton's mechanics would account for our experience, and the kitchen table exists because I scrub it. It seems to have shrunk during the holidays. The streets are much narrower than we remembered, and we had forgotten that the office was as depressing as this. To those who have seen the child, however dimly, however incredulously, the time being is, in a sense, the most trying time of all. For the innocent children who whispered so excitedly outside the locked door where they knew the presents to be, grew up when it was opened. Now, recollecting that moment, we can repress the joy, but the guilt remains conscious, remembering a stable where for once in our lives, everything became a you and nothing was an it. Thank you.